And welcome back to Capital Tonight. The New York State Association of School Business Officials released its annual report that takes a look at school district spending. Not surprisingly, spending is up, and the disparity between high needs and low needs districts also continues to rise. So what exactly is driving these increases, and where is most of the money going? I bet you have some educated guesses. I do. I'm going to put them to the head of the association to talk more about the findings. It's Michael Borges. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So first of all, what's interesting is that low needs districts are spending more per pupil than high needs districts. Is that right?
No. What it is that their tax rates tend to be higher and actually produce less revenue because your tax bases are low. You have to have higher tax increases to get almost.
So they're taxing more per pupil. Is
yes,
what you're
they're
saying.
taxing more per pupil, but they're raising less money. That's the economy there. It's sort of like, if you're making $100,000 a year and you get a 1% pay raise, and you're making $10,000 a year and get a 10% pay raise, who's going to make more money?
Got it.
So that's how the difference is between the tax rates between high need districts and low need districts.
And also there's a limited capability. I mean, aside from the tax cap, which of course is an extremely limited capability unless you override it, which we actually are starting to see, but more of. But there's a limited capability to, you actually basically tax out your residents. I mean, you just can't keep going back to the same well, particularly if people are house poor or in areas where home values have dropped.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sad part of the findings in this spending report is that there hasn't been a whole lot of change in the disparity between high need and low need districts. Despite doing away with the GEA and increases in aid over the past 3 or 4 years, the disparity has actually grown per pupil. It's now $5,800. So if you're in a high need or a low need wealthy school district, you're spending $5,800 more per student than a high need, less wealthy school district, and that has grown since 2011, 2012. So, that's why
even though the state has kicked in and increasingly,
right, which is why our Foundation A task force made recommendations to make tweaks, enhancements, so that we can drive more money to these high need, low wealth school districts.
Yeah, but interestingly, so the governor likes to say, and other people who are against just sort of throwing money at the problem, as you and I have discussed, like to say, well, we spend the most per pupil.
And we do.
And we do.
Yeah.
But where that money is going, when you say we spend the most per pupil, it sounds like all that money is going to the kid. But the reality is that most of that money is not going to the kid. A disproportionate amount of that money is going to things like teacher pensions, which are costs going up, healthcare, and also, which was interesting, special ed. And we'll get to that because it's kind of its own category, really. But look, I mean, pension costs are very high. There's been some legal challenges to teacher pensions, of course, but that's part of the reason why teachers get in, and they get their summers off, obviously. Yeah. But I mean, they don't get paid a whole heck of a lot, and the pension is a perk.
Well, again, education, like healthcare, is very labor intensive. You need people in the classrooms, you need all the support to produce a quality education. So I don't begrudge the salaries that they're making or the benefits that they're making. We're just pointing out that those costs are growing disproportionately to other parts of school spending. And we need to do something differently than we've done in the past so that more of the money is directed to those things that help students most, that gets the best results for our bank, the biggest bang for our buck. And you pointed out in the study that pension costs have grown 155%, healthcare costs 59%, special ed 111% during the period of the study.
But pensions are constitutionally protected. I mean, there's not a lot you can do about that.
Most of the stuff that we spend money on is state mandated, state required.
Right.
So when the governor says it's school districts' fault for the situation that we're in and that we could solve the problem, we're only really a part of the equation. It really has to do with the legislature and the governor agreeing to make changes that will reduce our costs. The tax cap is sort of is a misnomer in the sense that it caps our revenue but doesn't cap our expenses.
It's a blunt instrument, is what it is really.
Yeah, and it's punitive. And so we're just saying, here's where our spending is. Is this really where we want to spend the money? And is there a better way to do it?
Well, what could you do about pensions?
Well, I mean, I think what the governor should be doing is, he had a mandate relief council that he created, I don't know, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago?
All those many years ago,
yes. All those many years ago, and it just kind of went by the wayside. I think maybe it's time to reconstitute that that Mandate Relief Council and give it some
Oh,
real
it was
teeth.
supposed to be hand in hand with the tax cap, if I remember correctly. You were supposed to get mandate relief, in
Relief with the
exchange,
tax cap,
and they would
yes.
argue, well, yes, actually, we did create a sixth pension tier. I do remember this argument dimly in the
Yes,
fogginess
yes,
of my
yes,
brain.
yeah.
But the thing is that the savings from that tier are not going to be realized for many years.
Yes, yeah.
So the other thing, let's talk a little bit about special ed. This is a bit of a third rail.
Yes.
I mean, now the reality is that New York has a very generous special education
We're
program,
the
and people
Cadillac of the country,
move
yeah.
in from other states
Correct.
seeking these services.
Right.
And that's great that kids who need it can get these services, but these services are very expensive.
Right.
So expensive. We're actually educating some kids out of state.
Oh, definitely.
And that's
yeah.
mandated.
That's what that tuition. There was one of the things that one of the big increases over the last 9 to 10 years was that other tuition, and that other tuition means sending kids to special ed school districts or private schools for special ed. So yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is take a look at. I think it's now 4 years ago that the state education department actually came out with a report of its own. It was 30 pages with 200 recommendations where it identified where the state exceeds federal requirements for providing special ed.
Yeah, but every time you start having this conversation,
I know, it goes nowhere.
well, it goes nowhere in part because not you, the euphemistic you, look like a monster when you say, well, we got to talk about taking away some of these services, and then they bring out the children who benefit from the services, and you're like,
Well,
it's a very difficult thing. I mean, how could you take services away from kids who so desperately need
We're not
them?
talking about taking away services, we're talking about making the process more efficient. The process for identifying, for arbitrating, for deciding, for the types of services that we provide. Do we have to spend $100,000 or could we spend $50,000 on providing the same service? We need to look at ways how we spend our money. It's not always about how much money, although that is important, but it's also, position is how do we spend that money? Can we do it more effectively? Can we do it more efficiently and get it the biggest bang
Well,
for our
because we don't want to have a conversation about these difficult areas. I mean, healthcare is also its own animal because we're going to have a federal conversation about healthcare that could bring us in all sorts of different directions. That said, a lot of this is subject to arbitration. I mean, healthcare is subject to arbitration, and that's a district by district thing, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's subject to union negotiations.
Right.
Yeah, right. So yes, but there are things the state can do to help us reduce costs. So last week I had a meeting, with the state Division of Budget, and we were talking about how can the state help school districts and local governments reduce healthcare costs. Well, perhaps they can create a statewide pharmacy plan where we can pool the buying power
had one of those
of
already.
local government. Well, there's NYSABO, the New York State Insurance health insurance plan,
Right.
that local governments and school districts participate in. But the problem with NYSABO is that it's on a statewide average.
Oh.
So if you're on Long Island, you're getting a bargain. If you're in Plattsburgh or in Oneonta, you're not getting so much of a
Well,
bargain.
in Plattsburgh, you look across the border and think, oh, it's looking awfully attractive to buy my dress
Right.
from Canada.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're saying, there are things the state can do to help drive down healthcare costs, which are one of the biggest increases over this 9 to 10 year period.
Right. Okay. So the thing that also is not discussed here, but we talk about disparities, and I want to talk to you about this because we opened this area of discussion last week, is school construction.
Right.
Now we're seeing a lot of school construction votes going on, and they're
Right.
passing. They're very low turnout votes. There was a very controversial one that happened here in Albany that
Right.
failed, actually. Albany County Controller Mike Connors, some people might have remembered seeing him, he did come in here and he said he wanted to see those votes held concurrent with existing election days because he believes that this is like active voter suppression to maximize the chances of the passage of a bond act when you schedule it on like a Tuesday in May or whatever, some day that's not, that voters aren't used to going to the polls. And you actually wrote a rebuttal to him in the Times-Union, but you're here now, so you might as well just consolidate it and tell us what it was.
Right. Well, school districts have a sort of a long process for getting capital projects on the board, approved by the voters, in the pipeline. So they have to actually work backwards from a particular date in order for all the timelines and deadlines to be met. So basically they start working in the spring for a budget vote that happens in November typically or December. So that way they can take advantage of the cheap. When you go out to bid for an outdoor work project, it's better to bid in the winter months when contractors have no business.
Right.
So it's better to go out to bid then, and then because we don't want to disrupt the school calendar year, we don't want to take kids out of their classrooms or make it
Yeah,
inconvenient
you have
for
a finite window of when
we have
work can
yeah,
go
so
on.
that way when we go out to bid in the winter months, We decide, we do selection in the spring,
But Michael,
and that way by May and June, construction can start
yes, I
and
understand.
be just less disruptive.
And you also argue if everybody was going to bid at
the same exact
time, it
time,
would be driving costs up,
we
and
would.
that would happen
Just
if all
imagine-
bonds were held, votes were
If
held on the
all
same
the
day.
governments in Albany County went out to bid for
Yeah.
asphalt at the same
Except
time.
that wouldn't happen. I
Yeah.
mean, the reality is that not every bond construction vote would be happening on the same day, in the same year, at the same time, and
Well,
then
not every,
everybody would
every
en masse
school
go.
district, but a lot of school districts. We were just talking about how many school districts locally were having bond votes.
Yes, a lot
So
of
just
them.
imagine 8, 10, 12 school districts all going out to bond at the same time, all in the same area. How many different contractors do you think there are that are qualified
Not
to
a
do
lot. But don't you
school
think that it would be fairer if more people were participating?
Well, yeah. I mean, that goes for the presidential election. I mean, more people could participate,
Yes,
but,
I
but
agree.
we don't. And we see that even when we came out with our report on school budget votes. There's been a steady decline since the tax cap.
Yes, and yet
Yeah.
the high percentage of them continue to pass.
Right,
interestingly.
exactly. So, I mean, yes, we want to encourage people to participate, and there are definitely ways we can do that. You know, more education, more awareness, but I don't think having it all on the same day actually benefits the taxpayer.
Okay, well, we should just let people know and remind them the comptroller is pushing this issue. He wants the
county
Albany
comptroller, yes.
right. He wants the Albany delegation to carry this. It's really in the nascent stages, and so I'm sure we'll have more of a discussion. And the Attorney General, who put out a voting reform plan yesterday, did not address this issue, but sort of anecdotally was asked in a press conference and said, yeah, he's all for anything that has fewer days of elections because it's cheaper for, to run fewer rather than more for local governments, which are also cash strapped. And he's big on participation. So we'll see.
Right.
We'll see is the final word. And I thank you very much. Obviously, all this goes into the hopper, and we mix it up for budget day and then budget negotiations.
Yes.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
being
for having
here.
me.
My pleasure.